When the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, it created an unprecedented crisis. Nations and scientists scrambled to find any effective treatment to combat the novel coronavirus. In this climate of extreme urgency, many existing drugs were re-examined for potential new uses. One such drug was Favipiravir, an antiviral medication that suddenly found itself in the international spotlight. The world was desperate for a simple oral medication that could be taken at home, reducing the immense pressure on hospitals that were quickly becoming overwhelmed with critically ill patients. The search was not just for a cure, but for any tool that could manage the spiraling crisis. Favipiravir, originally developed in Japan under the brand name Avigan, was not a new discovery. It was approved there years earlier, but its use was heavily restricted. Japanese authorities permitted its prescription only for novel or re-emerging influenza viruses against which other antiviral drugs had proven ineffective. It was explicitly forbidden for treating common seasonal flu due to its significant safety profile. This strict control signaled that the drug carried substantial risks that were deemed acceptable only in the most dire public health emergencies, where no other alternatives existed. Its history was one of caution and limited application, a fact that would become central to later debates. The primary reason for this global reluctance was the drug's severe and well-documented safety risks. Animal studies had provided conclusive evidence that Favipiravir is a teratogen, meaning it can cause significant harm to a developing fetus. The research showed it could lead to embryo-fetal death and severe birth defects. This risk was so profound that the drug was classified as contraindicated for pregnant women worldwide. Consequently, major regulatory bodies, including the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, had never approved Favipiravir for any medical use, deeming its potential dangers to outweigh any unproven benefits for the general public. This global consensus of caution stood in stark contrast to the path India would eventually take. While other developed nations kept the drug off their pharmacy shelves, the unique pressures of the pandemic in India led to a different calculation. The established risk of teratogenicity was a known factor, but the unfolding catastrophe of COVID-19 created a new context for evaluating risk versus benefit. The drug's background as a restricted-use medication in Japan and its non-approval elsewhere set the stage for a major controversy when India decided to embrace it as a frontline treatment for its citizens battling the virus at home. In June 2020, as India grappled with a surging first wave of COVID-19, the Drug Controller General of India made a bold and controversial decision. It granted Emergency Use Authorization for Favipiravir to treat mild to moderate cases of the disease. This was not a full market approval, but a special provision made possible by the pandemic's extraordinary circumstances. Glenmark Pharmaceuticals was the first to receive this approval for its brand. FabiFlu and other generic versions soon followed. This decision instantly made an oral antiviral available to millions, a move that was seen by some as a necessary response to an unprecedented national health emergency that required swift and decisive action. The rationale behind this emergency approval was rooted in the harsh realities on the ground. India's healthcare system was buckling under the strain of an ever-increasing number of patients. Hospitals were running out of beds, oxygen supplies were dwindling, and the medical infrastructure was on the brink of collapse. In this desperate environment, the government and health officials were searching for any viable option to ease the burden. An affordable oral medication that could be administered at home seemed like a perfect solution. It offered the potential to manage patients with milder symptoms outside of the overwhelmed hospital system, freeing up critical resources for the most severe cases. Supporters of the decision argued that in the face of a rapidly spreading virus with no known cure, the potential benefits of an accessible treatment could not be ignored. The drug was relatively inexpensive to produce, making it an attractive option for a country with a large population and limited healthcare spending per capita. The hope was that Favipiravir could reduce the duration of the illness or prevent mild cases from progressing to severe disease, thereby saving lives and preserving hospital capacity. This line of reasoning prioritized immediate practical solutions over the lengthy process of waiting for perfect conclusive data, a luxury many felt India could not afford at that moment. However, this approval came with strict conditions designed to mitigate its known risks. The authorization was for restricted use, which legally required that every patient provide signed, informed consent before receiving the medication. This consent form was intended to explicitly warn patients, particularly women of childbearing age, about the severe risk of birth defects, and the absolute necessity of using effective contraception. The measure was an attempt to balance the urgent need for a treatment with the ethical obligation to inform patients about the significant potential for harm, placing the final decision in the hands of the individual and their doctor. The approval of Favipiravir immediately sparked a fierce debate within India's medical and scientific communities. On one side were those who supported the government's decisive action. They pointed to the dire need for any available weapon against the virus. With hospitals overflowing and people dying, the argument was that waiting for perfect evidence was not a practical option. They cited small preliminary studies, some from Russia and China, that suggested the drug might help reduce viral load and improve clinical outcomes in patients with mild to moderate COVID-19. For these supporters, the potential to save lives in the present moment outweighed the theoretical risks and the lack of robust data. On the other side were the numerous critics and public health experts who raised serious alarms. They argued that the decision was based on extremely weak and often low-quality evidence. No large-scale, randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of medical research, had demonstrated a clear clinical benefit, such as preventing hospitalizations or deaths. The World Health Organization itself had advised against using Favipiravir for COVID-19 outside of clinical trials due to this very lack of convincing data. These skeptics believed that promoting a drug with unproven efficacy could create a false sense of security and lead to poor public health outcomes. The core of the controversy lay in the risk-benefit analysis. Critics argued that the known severe risk of teratogenicity posed an unacceptable public health hazard, especially in a country as vast and diverse as India. They questioned whether the informed consent requirement could be effectively implemented on a mass scale, ensuring that every patient understood the dangers and that women of childbearing potential were properly tested for pregnancy and adhered to contraception was a monumental challenge. The potential for a wave of drug-induced birth defects was a frightening prospect that, in their view, far outweighed the drug's unproven and questionable benefits against COVID-19. This debate highlighted a fundamental tension in pandemic management, the need for speed versus the need for certainty. While proponents saw Favipiravir as a pragmatic tool to manage a crisis, opponents saw it as a dangerous gamble that compromised patient safety standards. They contended that even in an emergency, the principle of first, do no harm should prevail. Approving a drug with strong evidence of harm and weak evidence of benefit, they argued, set a dangerous precedent. The divide between these two perspectives defined the story of Favipiravir in India, turning it into one of the most contentious medical decisions of the pandemic era. As the COVID-19 pandemic evolved, so did the story of Favipiravir in India. Over time, more robust clinical trials were conducted globally, and the initial hopes for the drug began to fade. The emerging evidence failed to show any significant clinical benefit in treating COVID-19. Studies did not demonstrate that Favipiravir prevented hospitalization, reduced mortality, or significantly hastened recovery in a meaningful way. As this stronger scientific evidence became available, and as other, more effective treatments like monoclonal antibodies and safer antiviral alternatives emerged, the medical community's reliance on Favipiravir started to wane. Prescriptions for the drug declined sharply across the country. Despite its dwindling use and the mounting evidence against its efficacy for COVID-19, the drug's regulatory status in India remains in a peculiar state of limbo. The Emergency Use Authorization granted during the peak of the crisis was never formally revoked. This means that legally the drug can still be prescribed for mild to moderate COVID-19, even though it is no longer recommended in clinical guidelines or widely used by physicians. This regulatory inertia leaves a controversial drug on the market, a lingering relic of a more desperate time. It stands as a testament to how emergency decisions, once made, can be difficult to undo even when the circumstances that prompted them have changed. The episode serves as a powerful case study on the immense pressures that governments and regulatory bodies face during a public health crisis. The decision to approve Favipiravir was not made in a vacuum. It was a product of fear, uncertainty, and an overwhelming need to provide some form of hope and relief to a suffering population. It highlights the profound difficulty of making sound, evidence-based decisions when data is limited and time is short. India's gamble on Favipiravir underscores the stark differences in regulatory standards around the world, and the complex calculus involved in weighing unknown benefits against known severe risks. Ultimately, the story of Favipiravir in India offers a crucial lesson for the future. In the heat of a crisis, the fundamental principles of medical ethics and patient safety must remain paramount. While the desire for quick solutions is understandable, rushing to approve treatments without strong evidence of benefit can lead to significant risks and public health challenges. The balance between swift action and scientific rigor is delicate, but it must be carefully maintained. As we prepare for future pandemics, the legacy of Favipiravir reminds us that even in our most desperate moments, the commitment to safety and evidence must be our unwavering guide.